There we go. Well, thank you for that introduction. I think mentioning several economic presentations last year, I guess I'm the least wrong from where we were. Also, it mentioned disclaimers. I did not put a disclaimer page in this deck, and thankfully our compliance folks aren't in the room, but I will go with my own disclaimer, is that I have strong convictions, loosely held, so I literally may change my mind by this afternoon of anything you hear today, and so none of this obviously is financial advice unless I have entertained a bet with you over a steak dinner, one-to-one. So we'll jump into this. We're on the heels of the State of the Union address last night. A lot of things that I heard, we'll kind of touch on that at the end. I didn't put any of this obviously in the slides. But we're in a very unique year, so we're post the midterms. We are post-COVID, I think we can say, but we're here in 3D and not on a Zoom call, which is fantastic. It's good to actually shake hands, with a lot of you instead of staring at a 2D screen, like we have the last several years for all of us. So let's see here. So touch very quickly on what my economic base case is. So we are in a period of time that you look at, I would say Milton Friedman, everybody knows from an economic standpoint. And so we are looking at a period of time where you have a very limited supply of goods and services with a lot of money kind of sloshing around. And so that's the textbook definition of inflation. And so what I see happening today, and what the government authorities, both in Treasury and in the Fed, is that they are trying to control inflation with basically two very large hammers, and everything obviously looks like a nail to them. And so those two hammers are interest rates literally the money supply, how much money is out there. And they can't, unfortunately, the Fed cannot print toilet paper, used cars, or eggs. And so all of those things, you have to get the demand down as opposed to increasing the supply in a lot of instances. By the show of hands in here, I think all of us fall into this camp. The labor market is as tight as we've ever seen it. So there's 11 million open jobs for supposedly 6 million unemployed folks in this economy. The key that we have to avoid here, 30 plus years later, is not to redo the 70s. And not talking about shag carpet and bell bottoms. This is really periods of inflation that happened really 3 times where the Fed had to step in consecutively to fight this. So if you listen to Jerome Powell or any of the other Fed folks, they either have studied that time period. There's some folks that were actually young and around there in terms of their early careers. So they really need to take that inflation and anchor it to the floor to move forward. And so longer term, where do I think we go? I was a little bit spooked, 18, 24 months ago, that the Fed really kind of got out of the chute late in terms of fighting inflation. You could see the numbers rolling through month after month, the year after year number for inflation. So if everyone thinks about consumer price index, that's, you're looking at a year compared to now. And so they really kind of got out of the chute late. And they basically said, we're going to nail inflation down to 2%. And I was like, uh-oh, this is going to be a 40% decline in the stock market. All heck's going to break loose. And so we've seen that message start to change here in the last 12 months. 2-ish, I think, is where the goal is. So you look at the last 40 years, inflation tends to be around 2.8%. My thinking is that we are going to get a 2 handle on inflation. It may be 2.999, but that will be declared victory. I will mention this really quick from a CPI. We'll actually get, and I heard this yesterday from Jerome Powell. He was speaking right before the State of the Union. And he mentioned the word disinflation, and he was very confident in that. And so you're going to see some political rhetoric get ramped up here in February and March. So there were some changes to the way that CPI is calculated, and so that change will start hitting the books here next month. And so they're changing, so it's a year-over-year measure, as I mentioned, but they use 2 years worth of data to smooth it. They're actually taking away that smoothing and just using year over year. And then they're also changing the calculation, how they calculate homeowners equivalent rent, which is the largest portion of inflation. Both of those are going to hit. Now, I don't know if it's going to be a 0.2 or a 0.5 or a 0.7 change to CPI, but when you look at CNBC or Bloomberg starting next month, you're going to see a lower number, all else being equal, from that. And I think, obviously Powell knows that. So you can see here, to stick the landing, I think the Fed is going to have to pull up short. I'll talk about a little bit later on why. But I would put the odds at a soft landing at less than 30% at this point, probably more of a traditional run-of-the-mill recession, especially if the Fed continues to move forward. Just really quickly, I know it's hard to see this, but basically this is the top, or the number of employed in the country as of January, 160 million openings. In the middle, you'll see here, this is job openings, and then at the bottom, so this is the labor force. So the labor force obviously fell off during COVID. A lot of folks had, government transfer money, kind of went out of the workforce, and now that is back to all-time highs. The issue is, you can see there with the job openings, far exceed the pre-COVID levels. I mentioned earlier two job openings for every unemployed person in the country. You can see this here. This is the number the Fed needs to get down. This affects wage inflation much more than anything else. And so as we see this continue to hover up here at the number it is, this is troublesome to me, and I think why you're going to see the Fed kind of stay tightening longer for later is that the Fed needs to manufacture a recession in job openings, but not manufacture a recession or cause a lot of job cuts. And that is a tight wire that I can't walk. I hope they can. So that's going to be a very difficult process for them to do. And so where that leads to, from the previous screen, is we talked about wages. So you can see here average hourly earnings, and then we have the National Federation of Independent Businesses is the gray line. And so that kind of looks out into the future 3 months or so, and so we still see 4 to 5% wage inflation, being persistent here, through the rest of this year into next. The Fed obviously would love to get that down, something closer to 2 to 3%, but this is the part of inflation that we refer to as sticky. So sticky inflation means that a price goes up and it's very apt to not go down. The most sticky part of inflation are coin-operated laundry machines. Once the price goes up, they never go back down. But as you can imagine, that's just not a big part of inflation. And so the two sticky parts they're worried about, obviously, are wages, because usually when you give a raise, you're apt to not take that back. And then obviously housing. So once housing goes up, it's apt to not go down either. So where we are seeing rolling over, and this is why I think that the recession's probably going to be a little bit worse than a soft landing, is that we're seeing the ISM. I think everybody's probably familiar with that index, Institute of Supply Management. Everything is rolling over here. When I was here in October, this looked a whole lot better. It was hanging in there, but this is what you would expect given what the Fed's doing, as it relates to the cost of capital, being moved up through the system across the board. Over here on the right, so this is ISM services, and so this is everything that's not manufactured, and it started like it was going to go down, and then we just had this very abrupt bounce back here in January, which is, it's good, but once again the Fed wants to see weakness, and they are not seeing it here as well. So that bounce back in the services index, bounce back in new orders, healthy for the economy, but the Fed did not want to see that. Talk about housing. Obviously, being here in Florida, this probably doesn't apply, but you're seeing home prices rolling over nationwide. There are roughly 55 to 60% of counties in the country have a year-over-year negative house price number. And then you can see here residential construction, a lot of that obviously having to do with the supply chains, that's being worked through. But all else being equal, the belief is that housing prices, if they follow the residential construction spending, we're going to see some more negative coming up here in the middle to the latter part of this year. So not not terrible, but this is the part of inflation where the Fed is having success, is moving down this homeowner's equivalent rent, as they would call it. So where are we now? So the Fed, announced here recently they're raising interest rates 25 basis points. Wall Street is a bunch of stubborn people, and so you can see here from this chart, they keep on thinking the Fed's going to pause, the Fed's going to stop, the Fed's going to pause. I feel like they're telling us we're not going to do that, but yet interest rate bets for later this year is that the Fed's going to cut and lower interest rates going into 2024. Not so sure about that. So we've still got a lot of money sloshing around the economy, and so they're pretty intent. So we can see here, implied rates, moving into the rest of this year. We're looking at a terminal rate somewhere north of 5%, most likely, is what's being priced in. So I've obviously worked for a bank. Let's kind of talk about banking for a little bit. So top graph and so obviously a bunch of different things that you can't see, but in general, just look at the chart moving up. So this is basically how tight the banks are on various types of lending. And as you can see, during COVID, got very, very lax from a lending standpoint, and now we're seeing a complete reversal of that and moving up. Coupled with that, picked out the big four here at the bottom: J.P. Morgan, Wells, Citi, and B of A. And so we all know loan loss provisions from the great financial crisis and how ugly that was. So we are seeing loan loss reserves starting to build back. They are minute at this point compared to past history, sort of in line. We'll be watching this very closely. As you can imagine, banking has become very real estate driven from a lending standpoint, and so real estate prices and where those go will drive where this goes from banks' standpoint. I will mention this; it's not in the slide, but banks do have, and this is left over from the financial crisis. We obviously own a lot of bonds, and a lot of bonds that were bought over the last 4 or 5 years. And so if you look at the mark-to-market value of a lot of bonds on banks' balance sheets, there's a lot of negative equity there as well. Quite frankly, the Fed has it too. So that's sort of where the regulators are kind of letting us don't look over there kind of thing right now. But as you look at the bank's balance sheets, a lot of these bonds that were bought at 1-2%, obviously, you can buy a six-month T-bill, for well over 4%. And so these mark-to-market losses are also hiding in here, but don't show up in the loan loss provisions. So I think, and this is the most important part of where we start to look at, what happens from here. And this is market liquidity. Once you start getting liquidity drained out of the system, yes, it helps with inflation, but because we have such a levered economy, this can really cause significant issues, as you kind of roll through, the sucking out of this. 2 ways you get money in or out of the economy. Obviously, the Fed has a magic money printer, so they can just dial it up. They don't even have to print anymore. They just hit a couple keystrokes and it's there. The second is the fractional reserve banking system. So you put $10 on deposit with South State, we can loan up to $100 on your $10 deposit. And so we're seeing liquidity. You saw earlier the banking system with the tightness of the credit, and obviously the Fed is retracting capital through its quantitative tightening program. And so you're seeing this significant drawdown in liquidity. So you can see it up here. The Fed's balance sheet is slowly starting to roll over. Commercial bank deposits, top right, are starting to roll over. And then we call overnight repos, bottom left. So this is money basically stuck at the Fed overnight, starting to roll over as well. It's peaked out at right about $2 trillion. And you can see here the S&P 500, in general, liquidity affects stock prices, as you can imagine. So let's talk about kind of where this liquidity is and maybe why we aren't in a worse scenario than we are now. So I'll refer to Jerome Powell as Uncle Jerome, and I'll refer to Janet Yellen as Aunt Yellen. You can see here, there's Aunt Yellen at the slot machines. So what's really been interesting, and I think, I'm not sure Jerome and Janet are talking at this point. But so here at the top piece, you'll see what's called the Bloomberg Financial Conditions Index. And so this just measures, how are things loose or are things tight? It's a plus or minus around a mean. And you can see here, once we got into Ukraine and the first rate hike, financial conditions started to worsen pretty quickly. What's interesting is really since October, and that October dot, and this is not in here because it just got released, where the bottom of that was actually an IMF meeting, surprisingly, not surprisingly. And so out of that IMF meeting, that's when Japan started. They did 2 injections of liquidity very quietly into to buy their bonds. And then you saw really, what you see here at the bottom is the Treasury functions just like our household. They have a checking account, numerous checking accounts, of which when they sell bonds or collect taxes, that comes into the Treasury for them to spend. And so twice now, so when Trump left office, he left, $1.6 trillion in that, those checking accounts for the Treasury. So that got spent down, related to COVID. And then when we raised the debt ceiling in 2021, basically you had another bond issuance spree of which Yellen's Treasury refilled that. And basically she's been unloading this like a bazooka ever since quantitative tightening started at the Fed. And it doesn't, because those are bonds issued and that cash was brought in, it does not show up in your typical monetary base. So this is being spending. It looks like M2 and a lot of these different financial measures are moving down, when all actuality the cash out there is not. So this really plays into a really unique dynamic, I think, that we're going to get into, and it's sort of going to be mentioned I'm a tennis player, so I refer to these as foot faults, and these would be an error that you didn't need to cause. So over here on the next screen, we've been in a recession, kind of in that 2021 period. Mentioned I'm from South Carolina, so I wear my redneck badge with pride. But so this recession, so you think about a typical recession is, you got 2% inflation, 0% GDP. I mean, it feels awful. You're just stuck in the mud. You're not going anywhere else. Not going anywhere. The recession we had was, we got a big four-wheeler. We're stuck in the mud, and we are just slinging mud everywhere. So you've got GDP at 4 or 5 or 6, but inflation is above that. And so that's a negative GDP once you strip out inflation. So we hit a technical definition of a recession, but man, look at all the stuff going on in the economy. Not much productivity at all, probably none. But that type of recession feels dramatically different than a 0% GDP or basically stall speed. So where we've been since then is, you look here, 20% of the consumer, or 20% of the folks in this country do 40% of the consumer spending, usually of the larger ticket items. And so the first recession, and we've been in this for a while, are the folks that live paycheck to paycheck. And so, as you look at inflation, vis-a-vis their spending, it's been a pretty tight spot. And we've seen that to a certain extent get replaced with a lot of consumer credit debt, revolving debt that's been moving up significantly. But this is where I get really concerned about sort of this, yes, we hit a technical definition of a recession, but where does this feel bad? And these folks, these highest 20%, I'm imagining everybody in the room falls into this category, you react more towards your balance sheet than you do necessarily the price of eggs or whatever it is going up. And so when you look at, so Fidelity just released the average 401k balance was down over 20% last year. We're starting to see obviously some real estate prices roll over. Things like private equity, starting to roll over. And so this really becomes, where you could get sort of the nasty second recession is that, yes, inflation's falling, but you get a GDP that looks something a lot closer to zero or maybe negative. And so this brings me to the foot fault from a tennis standpoint is we've had 2 tax cuts, Bush and Trump, that really moved the taxes, much more progressive into the upper incomes. And so you think about 2020 and 2021, 2021 was a landmark all-time high in terms of tax collections in April. And so that was a very big benefit to the Treasury and made sort of the 2021 debt ceiling argument didn't get very far at all. What worries me about this is that we look at, so this is shareholder wealth, so this would be stocks and all these other kind of things, and then you look at taxes on a one-year lag. The belief today is that the debt ceiling will hit it sometime, or we've hit it, but basically the Treasury just flat out runs out of money in August or September. You can do, if you basically can make it to September 30th, you can do some things that really just kind of make the debt ceiling a moot point to a certain extent. My worry is that we're going to hit the debt ceiling in early May or maybe in early June. And so that makes it much more precarious. You look at the first debt ceiling really showdown, which was John Boehner and President Obama. And the S&P had about a 17-18% decline because if you remember back in that time, we basically started sequentially shutting down the government as this went on. We've started that already, so we're already into extraordinary measures, but we basically are deferring payments into retirement plans and some things that aren't that big of a deal. But this really comes, as this stretches on, this is something I see as, we could definitely hurt ourselves if we're not careful. As I mentioned, from a debt limit standpoint, I do think this is going to be messy. I think it gets done, obviously. See a low probability of just an outright default. May see a technical default where some of the government's bills don't get paid. The last time that we did that, S&P lowered the credit rating on the U.S., so would definitely not want to necessarily see that again. The big issue, and I think it's a relevant issue, is you look at the percent of debt held by the public, going out from here, it just gets worse. COVID really, as my joke is, I was hoping to be retired by the time we had to deal with Medicare expenses. And I think that we're all going to live to see how this plays out. COVID and the debt associated with COVID really has pulled a lot of this forward, about 10 years worth. So this is going to be a problem that we're all going to have to deal with, and I think is one of the issues of our time. So you can see here, federal net interest costs as a percent of GDP. So it used to be 3% when interest rates were a whole lot higher. It's not that we did any good in terms of borrowing money. We just drove interest rates to zero, and so the percentage of interest coming out of GDP was very low. And this number is going to skyrocket. You can see here on the right, net interest as we move through the next 15 years really starts to go up. And so the question becomes, does the Fed become the Bank of Japan and basically play a yield curve control type game? Obviously they're not saying that, but we can. This train has left the station and it's heading down the tracks. Talk really quickly. I was talking to some folks before we came up here. There's a huge benefit that the U.S. is going to have over a lack of transparency and maybe a lack of trust with China as it relates to supply chains. Can't find a single somebody sitting in a CEO, COO role that isn't looked to at least diversify their supply chains out of China if they're exclusively there. And so as you can see here, the great financial crisis was actually the peak in world trade as a share of GDP. And I think you're going to see a lot more onshoring, reshoring. The popular word is friendshoring, so countries that you have a good relationship with. And so you could see this trade actually start to diminish as you get as you get supply chains brought back home. And you can see that even here. So this picks up going through COVID. You can see here, so July 18, Trump put in the first tariffs, and then we had the pandemic in March of 2020. But you can see here, so the China decrease is still there. That gap is still present. But then you look at the rest of the world, and that actually is, for the U.S. has recovered. It's pre-COVID high, which is good. So I would expect you would see this to continue, and I think it's going to provide a lot of opportunities for companies. Sort of the hot the hot real estate investment, 2 years ago was industrial warehousing, as everybody was moving to a just-in-case instead of a just-in-time inventory system. And so as we move through this, I do think you're going to see manufacturing is going to come back. It's already coming back. Everyone obviously sees that, but it's going to come back in a way that I don't think you're going to see. I live 10 minutes from a BMW factory, and it's gigantic, it's beautiful, but you're going to see a lot of automation. You're going to see a significant amount of robotics. I remember the 3D printing boom bust from 20 plus years ago. Things like 3D printing are really hitting their stride now, and that's a good thing. You look at the percentage of the working population divided into the population, and that percentage has peaked, and it's rolling over, and it's going to go down. And so you're going to have a lot more folks out of the workforce. So if we had to replace one for one, obviously can't do it. And so we're going to need to see, the step up from a technology standpoint to do a lot of this. I do think the layoffs, that we've seen, everyone's trying to tease out. So we saw the unemployment number come out here in the last couple days, and then the Challenger job cuts also came out, and they tell a completely different story. I would just say, so the unemployment numbers, those in January, they basically take into effect the government's birth-death model. So you can get some really wacky numbers on that. So I'm going to wait for the next kind of two months for that to come out. The good news, bad news is, from a job cut standpoint, I shouldn't joke about this, but it's a little bit funny. So I saw Google did layoffs, and I'm like, are they really laying people off? And so if you go in and dig into the data of Google's layoffs, they're not the hardcore network engineers that are getting laid off. They're literally laying off office masseuses and baristas. So why don't we have masseuses and baristas at South State? That's my only question. So, so you're getting the belt tightening, but it's obviously, tech lives in a different la-la land, as you can imagine, just from their profit margins. So they are themselves starting to tighten their belt. So in summary, recession odds very high. Basically, there's a axiom in the investment industry is don't fight the Fed. So if the Fed's being loose and you just think the world's coming to an end, the stock market's going to go up because the Fed basically provides that liquidity. We're in the same thing now as don't fight the Fed. The Fed is, they want to induce a soft landing, as they said, and my belief is we're going to get there. I do think inflation is topped. As I mentioned before, there's a little bit of maybe moving the goals to a certain extent. But just inflation in general, even if we didn't have the tweaks to the numbers, the peak looks to be in from now. I don't see that reversing. But really watching employment and wage growth is the sticky part, and that's where the Fed is focused on right now. Higher interest rates and tighter credit standards, they're a feedback loop into recession. The good news is I can honestly say I didn't see this in South State, but I saw South State lose some loans to some competitors over the last couple of years, and I'm going, I don't know if I would have lent my money that way. And that's coming to an end. Geopolitical issues are a wild card. Obviously, we have what's going on in Europe with Ukraine and Russia is a big deal. I would argue and go on the record and say we're almost in an economic Cold War with China at this point. Which is obviously why we're diversifying supply chains like we are. Resolving the debt ceiling is going to be key to having a more benign recession. To the extent that we have to haphazardly start shutting things down from a government spending standpoint, I'm not a card-carrying libertarian, but I'm not far from it. So I'm like, yes, slow down government spending, but it's government spending is north of 20% of GDP now. And so if you hit the brakes on that haphazardly, it causes a real major recession, in my opinion, very much like we saw under the Obama-Boehner framework, which was, as I mentioned before, that was self-inflicted. That is the end of my prepared remarks, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Yes, sir.
If you were to exclude our penchant as a country to ship balance of dollars all over the
In, so how much, so you, ask your question again?
If you were to exclude our desire to ship money to these countries,
Right.
how much of that impact could have been avoided, if any?
The debt impact?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to quote you a percentage. You know, you know, see how I put this politically correct. Ukraine has been a very corrupt country for a very long time. I don't like that personally, I don't like that we're sending them money without an inspector general or something attached to it to know where it's going. You know, I mean, I saw the report. We're sending them 31 tanks, I think I saw, but the U.S. wants to be so disentangled from that we're not even sending them the M1 Abrams we have. We have to go build those 31 tanks, and they're basically putting 1970s armor on them because they don't want the Russians to capture one of our new tanks with all the new technology built into it. I mean, obviously, it's been an expense, and it's hard to say where the dollars are well spent or not well spent. But I would say Putin could have invaded any other country besides the Ukraine, and things wouldn't have been nearly as bad. The Ukraine is basically like the industrial base and the agricultural base for a lot of Europe and the Middle East. You couldn't have picked a worse country from any. I mean, obviously he picked that for a particular reason. I think. It's interesting. I dabble in conspiracy theories, but so Putin flew to the Olympics in China, and this got reported by the New York Times also. So I think it's valid. And President Xi basically told him, "Don't upstage us, with the Olympics." And literally the next week he invaded Ukraine. So I see a lot of this. China's fingerprints are on this from behind, to a certain extent. Not popular to say that, but it's there, and you can see it. And there's a pretty big, I would say one of my bigger concerns is the world's becoming really multipolar or even bipolar. And so you're seeing the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and then OPEC are all kind of forming this alliance really against NATO, Japan. They have 60% of the world's population and over half the world's resources. Becomes a much tougher environment economically, and what they're trying to put together, and I don't know if they're going to be successful in this or not, but they're basically trying to replace the U.S. dollar as a medium of exchange amongst themselves. But nobody wants to be. It's actually not good to be the world's reserve currency, because you basically become the Saudi Arabia of money as the world grows, and you get the associated debt with it. Hence where we are today, from a U.S. standpoint. But that's where I get worried that inflation becomes more persistent, because they're almost trying to, in effect, put in place a barter system, with a neutral asset. And you get into that kind of time period, one, you're going to see much lower price earnings multiples on stocks. Obviously, commodities become a much more persistent inflation in your face. And so I know I just went on a tangent off your Ukraine piece, but that specific reason, I think, is why Putin is there, or one of them. Yes, sir.
I have two questions, and they kind of relate to what you were saying. And it's simple. Is there a ratio, and what would it mean in productivity to employment on one side? And the other, in sovereign wealth funds investments, you trace the money. Are they tracing that at all? Like you said, with all of the money supply, you got these countries with huge amounts of money. They don't necessarily like money. And so they might take the investment, blow the market.
Good. The last piece. I'm gonna come back to your first question. So so short answer is yes. So if you look at the largest, and let's just take debt for example. Stocks are also in this mix to a certain extent. But let's just take debt. So one of the financing issues that the U.S. government has going forward is that we were always, there were always willing buyers of our debt offshore. But as the U.S. dollar becomes more expensive, what they call the DXY, So that's the US dollar basically against the euro and the yen, and then a bunch of other smaller currencies behind it. When you do the currency conversion and the interest rates, it's still not even attractive to buy US debt now. You've got China, who's obviously a large holder of our debt. They could obviously, and some of this is shooting themselves in the foot, but they could be net sellers of debt. They actually are at this point. And then you've got, I think more importantly, Japan, who, a lot of folks are like, what's the doomsday scenario for the U.S.? Well, just look east at Japan, and I'll tell you what, we'll see what happens there, and I'll give you a pretty good explanation of how that will play out here. So Japan literally can't buy. They may need to start haphazardly liquidating their U.S. Treasury holdings to get U.S. dollars to intervene in their currency markets. And so that's my worst case scenario. It's very complicated, kind of working all that back, but it's, watching Japan's holding of U.S. Treasuries is very important, but I don't know the sovereign, so obviously several countries in the Middle East have sovereign wealth funds. My biggest concern would be the Treasury holdings of China and Japan. And your first question again?
First question is, if it means anything with productivity to the employment,
So,
how they affect.
so productivity productivity comes in bursts. So usually it's productivity tends to go down the more indebted a country is in general. And so we're not there yet, but we're getting close to, once you get north of 100% debt to GDP, it really markedly slows down the economy. Europe's there. I would say the UK obviously is there. Japan's been there. And China, can't unpack the numbers all that well, but they're there. I would say, you hear a lot of talk about, too many people. I would say for a lot of the world that is exactly opposite case, is that there aren't enough people. So say you wanted, so you get productivity with population growth. It's a known positive to GDP, but you look at the West, and we are graying at an enormously fast rate. And you go start having kids today, it's 16, 18 years before they're in the workforce. I forget the kilometers, but basically you go drop a pin in Malaysia, and it's a couple 100-kilometer circle, and more people live in that circle than outside that circle. And obviously it captures most of China, India, and Malaysia. But that's where you're seeing a lot of this production. Some of it's coming back to the U.S. India is going to be a big beneficiary of a lot of what we're seeing. But I think to me, I think we're going to see a lot of the productivity, as I mentioned, the benefits and detractions of what went, with NAFTA and a lot of the jobs going overseas. I think we're going to see a big benefit, but I also think it's going to come at a pretty high cost from a job standpoint. And the question is, are these people going to leave the workforce anyways? But this chat GBT, sort of the, people call it AI, I call it more machine learning. But this is going to be a really, really big deal. And so you're going to see productivity numbers probably go up, but you could see a pretty big layoff scheme in corporate America, white collar America, for a lot of these jobs that this technology is obviously well suited to do. I'll give you a quick example. Still dealing with it today. Got a dang printer back in my home office. Still can't get it to work. Just some gremlin pops up with an error message every 2 or 3 days. And it's, you call the help desk, put in a ticket, the guy or gal's out to lunch, will send me a picture of the error. It's like going on 3 weeks. You're going to have, pretty quickly here, you'll have machine learning bots that basically replace these IT folks in the back office, and you'll just put in a ticket to this machine learning and say, I got error code 00807, and it'll be done. And so it's, there's always transformation in the economy, but I really think that this is going to be a really big deal as it relates to, not creative thinking. I mean, obviously we're not anywhere near that with AI, but from a machine learning standpoint, and there's a known set of facts and circumstances to deal with, it is much, much more efficient than a human. So, yes, sir. So the AI thing, I actually had one of our clients, son-in-law's works for a company up in Boston that was working on it, and had dinner with him last year and just was kind of poking him with these questions. And he's like, well, we're nowhere near sort of, obviously sentient beings. But I've seen enough examples of, firsthand examples where just even some of the rudimentary stuff in terms of IT help desk. I saw a video, somebody trained a ChatGPT type machine learning to call Wells Fargo and negotiate and get wire charges refunded with no human intervention. And I think, my guess is, so that the fact that they're releasing this to the public, so Google just went public with theirs, Microsoft's putting it in the Bing search, so a version of ChatGPT has passed both the medical boards and the law tests. And so, you're going to see a lot of that is going to, I saw and a lot of this is obviously YouTube videos and sort of examples, but basically somebody took ChatGPT and took a particular law case, and it had access to, the law database, and basically said, go find and source all the case studies or all the cases and this and that. And it missed on one thing because something was footnoted wrong in a case from like 15 years ago, but otherwise it was exactly perfect. And so it's going to be a really big deal. And I think you're going to see it, as I said, not necessarily in the creative part of it. That's a tougher thing. But when it comes from get things from disparate databases and present me an answer, then that's here, and it's coming. It used to be, so if anyone here's Power BI users, you used to be able to, if you were really good with computers, you could get some of this, but it was really hard technical input. But the fact that you've got, the specific way that they put this machine learning interface together that is not sort of put together the same way a GPU is, you've got, sort of this latent memory, and it operates more like a brain than people think, but basically it can go in and piece things together a lot quicker. So I think it's here. The question is how does it get deployed, and who deploys it? But with wages as high as they are, it's my argument, my bull case for investing in a lot of manufacturing companies is, there's a lot of expense that's in $20+ an hour people to do whatever, and if you can't find the people, that's even worse. So I think you're going to see a lot of these, you see it in the big factories, but that's going to come down. I was meeting with a metals finisher basically for corrosion and doesn't conduct electricity and stuff like that, and they're launching into 3D printing, and using some of this machine learning stuff, and he said this can be a really big game changer for them. So. Yes, sir.
When do you think the Fed will start lowering rates? Because you mentioned that you think it'll be longer than what the market thinks.
So the market's pricing in end of the year going into 2024. So the Fed is a couple things, so I'm going to kind of unpack this. So you've got the Fed funds rate, which is how banks lend to each other. And there's two interest rates that are set to that worry me the most. And so, so if you put $1 in deposit with us, this is back from the financial crisis, we can actually send money to the Fed and earn the same interest rate. And so that's why you've seen loan rates move up so much. It's like, why make a 3.5% loan when I can get 4.5% from the Fed with no risk? And so, you have that interest rate, and then the Fed also allows non-banking, financial entities like money market funds can also put money at the Fed at that interest rate. What you think about, so I talked about the Fed being insolvent, so the Fed may actually have to do stealth quantitative easing. They may have to print money to pay interest this year because they're not earning enough money on their, so they earn money by the bonds on their balance sheet. Their average interest rate on a bond is 1.6% or a little bit lower. So you're getting 1.6, and basically you're paying everybody that comes to the front door 4.5, soon to be 5. I may not be that good at math, but I can figure that one out pretty quickly. So the Fed is going to have, and so at that point, the Fed actually has to come back from sort of an omnibus government spending bill, and it's left pocket, right pocket, but basically the Fed has to build its deficit into the government budget. So while the Fed, being a nonprofit bank, has been repatriating all of its interest the last several years, basically they have to go stick themselves as a line item as an expense on the federal budget. And what's key about that is you have the Republicans in control of the House. I would say, on average, they're more suspect of the Fed, I think, than the Democrats are. And so you could get some specific things that the Republicans want in terms of the Fed tweaking rules about QE or some of these other things. But in general, I mean, the Fed, all else being equal, needs lower interest rates, not only for their own sake, but we borrow like we're on a credit card from a U.S. standpoint. 60% of our debt's less than 6 years. And so you're talking a lot of debt that's right now sub 2% interest, and we'll reissue those treasuries at 4.5. You saw that interest rate increase. I mean, it's not a 10-year problem, it's a 2-year problem. And so, the Fed, all else being equal, I think will start to lower interest rates if they don't come in and basically tell the banking system and the money markets, hey, we're not, you can put money overnight with us, but we're not going to pay you 4.5% on it, which is, they need to do that. I think the reason that they're not doing it now is that if you went to South State and Bank of America and all these banks that are putting money at the Fed earning 4.5%, and we just said, hey, you're not getting interest on it anymore, then we go start loaning it out, and that would be a hyper boost for inflation. And so as I said, there's a delicate act they're trying to balance here. Yes, sir.
Last question. Thank you. So I have a question and a comment. The question is based on the sticky inflation. You talk about wages and you talk about your washing machines, for example. I work in construction. Do you think, and our belief in our company is that a lot of the current cost of parts will be sticky inflation. Like they're not going to come down. Even if demand goes down, our perception is that they're going to stay high, whether it's brakes, motors, whatever. Like the economy itself will not go down basis for the demand will go down. Do you have any experience on that it does go down, or is it rather that it's a new one that a lot of the inflation is just going to keep costs up and we'll have to adjust prices?
So the best example would be lumber. So obviously a direct input into construction went way up, not because we couldn't find any trees, you just couldn't get the throughput through the mills. I actually have a client that owns a mill. This goes to the supply chain. They were going to spend about $30 million to build a new planing mill, and I think you need like 4 or 5 different engines to build that. And one of the engines they couldn't get sourced for like a year, literally a year. And so they basically didn't do the investment, because you can't run a sawmill with 4 out of 5 engines. And so some of it's supply chain driven. So I mentioned the guy that was buying the nickel. I'll tell you his quick story. So he got a lot of his nickel from China, very cheap, but basically got force majeure multiple times through COVID in terms of not being able to get supply. Went to the Swiss, was able to get access to product, and obviously had to pay a lot for it. But he sells a lot of his products to GE. so GE's going, well, look at nickel prices. They're way down right now, and that's true for the raw material. But a lot of that raw material was sourced 9 months ago, and so the prices of the finished goods of that really expensive nickel have not yet worked their way through the supply chain. So, in general, you will see it's not as sticky as some of these other things like wages, but there is a time lag because a lot of that raw material, as it works its way through the finished product, it's still carrying its cost structure from the very beginning initial high cost. So, yes. I will comment, speaking about the college, it's, I do think you're going to see, applaud what you're doing. I mean, the retooling of kind of what we're going to see. As I mentioned, I've got a 7-year-old. I don't know that I'm going to tell him to be a financial advisor like myself, but it's, I look at things, it's engineers, it's architects, material science. If we're going to reindustrialize, I think you're going to see a lot of folks pivot, to do some of these things that, I wouldn't consider them blue collar, but it's sort of tech is spilling into the industrial and material space at a very quick pace, and that's where I see a lot of the future, for my 7-year-old if he's interested in that. So, thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you.
We had merged with Maynard Cooper as of last May. My particular practice is Government Solutions Group, as well as corporations, mergers, and acquisitions. So happy to be here. Okay, my apologies.
You want to redo?
They'll figure. We'll save it for later.
So I'm Bill Coker. I'm with South State Bank's Wealth Management Division. Jeff, I think you said I was a branch manager. If they put me in a branch, all hell would break loose. I've been in the financial services industry for 40 years. And the photo up there must have been taken a long time ago when I had a lot less gray hair. And that's what happens when you work with Brian Barker every day. I co-lead what we call the Private Wealth Division. We serve the needs of the company's high net worth clients. We do investment management, financial and estate planning, and trust administration. And I've been doing that for 20 years. The first 20 years in this industry, I was a commercial banker.
Good
morning, I'm Jed Grennan. I am a partner with the accounting firm of Grennan Fender. We've been here in Central Florida since 1975. We're a group of about 65 talented professionals with offices in Orlando and Melbourne, and soon to open an office in Tampa. We focus, as Jeff said, Jeff's my partner, on second stage companies, and hopefully I'm here to give some good wisdom to you all this morning. Thank you.
And good morning, once again, Josh McCoy, Greater Orlando Regional President. Many of you are clients of the bank, so you understand who we are, so I'll make my introductions brief, but we are located all throughout the state of Florida, up into Virginia and over into Alabama. We continue to grow, but we maintain a regional, independent community bank model, so all decisions that happen here in Greater Orlando run through the Greater Orlando regional offices. So while we're getting bigger, we want to be small. So we like to think big but act small.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Wayman Armstrong, local guy, high school. I go with my high school classmates here, Bishop Moore. I'm a Valencia grad and UCF, and defense contractor, working in modeling simulation training. And I want all y'all to know you can sleep good at night because we're great stewards of your tax dollars.
Wayman, since you've got the mic, let's go to you. You've been through a lot of ups and downs. Can you give us your perspective on leading your company through multiple recessions?
Sure, I would title it my backup plan. We went through the .com, as Ryan mentioned, .bomb era. I learned in that you don't go into a recession not making money, not having any money, and not owning money, because we failed all the above. We made it through by the skin of our teeth. By the time the next recession started, the great one, we were still, we were making money, but we were still in debt. We were paying off going through that. By not having some of the real-time reporting requirements we need, we got a little confident, and it caught us at the tail end. Unfortunately, I do some layoffs, and we learned from that as we are getting ready to go, or supposedly, as we look at what perception becomes reality. Where we are now, I think of, if you're familiar with Max Dupree, a professor at Harvard, also former CEO of Herman Miller. He had the best quote about being a leader from anyone I've ever heard. Our job as leaders is first and foremost is to define the current reality. So what do we look at when we look at the current reality going across? In God we trust. Everybody else bring data. Our real-time reporting has got much more accurate in that time frame. As working in modeling simulation, the power of what if, what can go wrong going through there as we go ahead and monitor that. We are going into it with us looking that in the middle of chaos lies opportunity, that we are still investing. We have in our internal research and development dollars and making that a priority. We're also knowing that what's important is having a relationship ongoing with your bank, and there's nothing more important than sharing where we are in real time and also where we see that forecast going. The last thing that going back to the quotes, there's two things. The second one is to say thank you. We create a culture through the mistakes that we've made. And we, as our team, hears what's going on. They see that we're a technology firm. They see the layoffs taking place. We've done everything we can to over-communicate to them. I'll give you an example. We do a weekly business development meeting. 8 people attended. We've opened up to the whole company. 2 weeks ago, we had over 37 people attending to know, here's what we're working on, here's what our pipeline is, here's what's going through. Even though we've had our best year in the county's history, the largest backlog, we know that people are anxious for what they hear. We want to give them confidence going forward. And if you're, for some people who've known me, have given me a little grief going back, having a backup plan, being wearing a tie for the first time in quite a while, well, having that backup plan, I've got to have a banker too, so I just did that for you, Josh. I wanted you to know that.
Okay, so you're kind of touching on some ideas about preparing for possible downturn or even recession. Let's have the other panel members. Bill, you want to talk about what you would do to prepare?
Sure, thanks. And so I'll answer that first from my perspective, having spent 20 years as a commercial banker. And what I would suggest that perhaps the most important thing that a business owner can do in the face of a potential decline in business activity is stay very close to your bankers. let them know what the opportunities that you see are, let them know what the challenges are and how those challenges might impact your cash flow. Thinking about those things and being proactive in your conversations with your banker, I think are critical. And when I say your banker, it might not only be the individual that is designated as your company's relationship manager. In most financial institutions today, there's not only a relationship manager who is the front guy that you can go play golf with or who will buy you lunch, but there is an individual or more than one individual behind that front guy who is that banker's credit partner. And at the end of the day, you will want to know both your relationship manager and who that credit partner is and have the opportunity to tell your story to that credit partner. And so that, to me, is far and away the most important thing that a business owner can do. I mean, there are other things just in terms of managing your balance sheet. Do you have the right level of inventory? You've got too much? Are your receivables still good quality receivables? Are your vendors in good financial health? And understanding how important those key vendors are in terms of giving you the product that you need to sell.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. To me, the key is having a plan. I mean, you have to have a plan for the worst case scenario. That means a cash flow projection. It means looking at your receivables closely, making sure that if someone starts to slip on payment schedule, especially if they've been historically a good payer, you need to watch that closely. And then from a staffing situation, no one likes to let people go, but if you're gonna, it doesn't do anybody good in your company if the company doesn't survive. So you need to have a plan for staff transition, and have that where you have the buy-in of all the people who are decision makers in your company. Because you don't want to get to that 12th hour where you have to make tough decisions and the group that needs to make those are not on the same page. So have a plan for cash flow and also have a plan for team transition if necessary.
I think it was in The Godfather where they said, keep your friends close and your banker closer. I mean, what I tell my clients, it's easy to come up with a policy to help survive a recession. I think everybody in this room pretty much knows some of the key tenets. Hone your business, watch your budgets. The trial in that, though, is in the execution. And with the execution with that, it really is a relationship at the end of the day. Do you have the relationship with that second person in the bank? Do you have that relationship with the vendor? Do you have that relationship with the customer? When the numbers start showing that we are entering a recession, or for whatever reason the business isn't doing as well, are you able to get into that room with that individual and say, this is what's going on, this is my plan for fixing it, and I need this opportunity to continue on my business? The last thing you want to do, and I think we all know this, is be knocking on the door of a stranger and making that request. That's really going to require, to a certain degree, a large amount of trust. So as a CEO, in my personal experience working with them, in my experience of reading the histories of these folks, it's not just about looking at what your budget is. You have to be maintaining the relationships that's going to keep you going through. I don't know anybody who survived the recession who did it by themselves.
Thank you. Okay, so regardless of whether we're heading into a recession or just a turn down, concern is it creates opportunities. So I'm going to go to Josh and ask you, what are other opportunities that business owners can take advantage of during a downturn or a recession?
I'll take a little bit from the comments from the last question. Relationships are key, right? We all know the relationships. The best CEOs, the best leaders, always know they're not the smartest person in the room. They surround themselves with people who they believe can help them get to where they want to go. The CEO, the leader, has the vision. They surround themselves with people who can get them there. So what can you do in an economic downturn, or really what we're talking about is a cycle? We talk about recession, it sounds negative. Recessions aren't always all bad for all people. We joked in the last recession, which was very harsh, we had 8% unemployment, but 92% of us were working. So sometimes we get stuck in the mindset that a cycle is negative. Cycles are actually very opportunistic. And so to the point of having a plan going into it, that is very vital to know how you can survive, but even more importantly, to understand what are the drivers of the cycle. Where are the opportunities? If you are in certain industries, this cycle will likely produce some great growth opportunities for you as one segment of the economy starts to go away. The horse and buggy is no longer here, the car is here, type of mentality. So always look for the opportunity in a recession, and to the point of have your banker close, have your attorney close, have your CPA close, have those advisors that you trust, that you know. Have the other CEOs that are in your network of friends. Bounce off ideas of, this is where what I'm hearing is happening in the economy. Here's where I think opportunity might lie for me, or here's where I think the risk is. So if you're in an industry that is going to face some significant risk in this downturn, then obviously you want to take a very defensive posture. If you're in an industry where you see opportunity, make sure your banker's on board with it. Make sure your CPA is advising you that you're reading this data correctly, and that your legal counsel is also on board with you. So that, to me, was how I would think about what this recession would mean, just like any other recession.
Thank you. Women, you want to weigh in on
No, I'll just give you an example. When we came through the last recession, we did not have a services arm. We looked at services as being a low margin piece. Development was where our history was. We opened up a services arm. What services? Recurring revenue, predictable profits, to help balance us off. We looked at the fact, besides Orlando, which is the epicenter of modeling simulation, and what other markets do we want to move into? Open an office in San Antonio, open one in Huntsville. Let's spread around different areas being funded at different time where we can go ahead and offset that. Capabilities. We didn't have an aviation component. We now have an aviation division. We brought in some really sharp retired military to help lead that. It's been one of our biggest growth sectors. So again, everything that we've heard from the panel here, we're doing the same thing, and I couldn't echo it. What Brian said earlier, we're only as good as teams. And Brian, I'm just glad he didn't use the Godfather metric that we're going to the mattresses, we're going to war. It's not that bad.
Bill?
So, just to add on to what Wayman and Josh said, and I add this wearing my wealth advisor hat. When you talk about opportunities that are created through the business cycle, in particular when the cycle appears to be negative, that is an opportunity for those of you that own closely held family businesses to look at various ways that you could transition some of that ownership to younger members of your family. And there are lots of ways that that can be done. They're not without complexity. You need the advice and assistance of a good tax attorney and a good CPA to help you figure out what the impact of some of those gifting strategies are. But the time to do that is when you are getting a lower valuation on your business. And lower valuations happen in recessions. Because what you want to do is get it out of your estate into a family member's estate before the value goes back up. And you heard Brian talking this morning about the government's need for funding, and the estate tax code, which currently allows a little over $12 million per person in exemptions from estate taxes, that drops on January the 1st of 2026 back to $5 million as adjusted for inflation. So that number may go from 12 down to 8 million per person, a big change. And so thinking proactively about ways to transition ownership to those rotten kids, I think is timely when we're facing a downturn in the economy.
That rotten kid is now becoming controlled.
And there are ways that you can transfer ownership without transferring control.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll start taking some questions from the audience. So, what are the leading indicators business owners should be watching for in terms of reality versus recession expectations? Brian, you want to start us?
Repeat the question.
Yep. What are the leading indicators business owners should be watching for in terms of reality versus recession expectations?
Right, so this is like a pet peeve of mine. I've had a lot of conversations with folks, and it typically comes down to, I was on the Peloton this morning, I was watching Bloomberg, I was watching CNBC, and they said basically the world's going to end. And then, 5 o'clock comes around, you look at how the stock market closed an hour earlier, and there's no indicator like that. The best way I feel, and again, I feel like we're kind of being repetitive today about going back to the principles. The core principles are talk to your customers, talk to your vendors, talk to your loaners, to your bankers, your investors. Those are the people that are almost universally going to be the ones who are impacting your economic success or decline. Whether or not GE had a good day tomorrow, unless you are a significant shareholder of GE, I don't necessarily think it's going to significantly impact your business. If your vendor is having supply issues, that is going to impact your business. If your customers had a massive layoff and they're experiencing a decrease in profit, that is going to affect your business. Keep your universe small, and I think that's going to give you a much better way of kind of filtering out the noise of a 24-hour news cycle versus the reality of what's going on with your specific business. And one thing I wanted to talk about, I didn't know if I was going to have an opportunity, but you mentioned going to the mattresses. So in a situation like this, I started out as a litigator, commercial litigation, and I started out really hitting the stride of that back around 2008 or so. And what I was seeing happening is, we had an economic issue, suddenly somebody didn't get something somewhere at some time the way they were supposed to, the way it was done in writing. And then, of course, the natural indication, or the natural reaction is, well, I'm going to sue. I'm going to sue this guy. He didn't bring it. I paid him the money. He didn't bring it. We're going to the lawsuit. What I've been kind of promoting lately is and you may have not heard of this type of thing, basically an economic downturn clause. Because it's kind of like a first cousin for the force majeure, which is basically, if something bad happens, if a pandemic happens, or a disaster, if I have supply chain in Turkey, for example, and we just had a massive earthquake there, that's a disruption. I can't deliver, so I'm breaking the contract. But that kind of leaves everybody on the other side of that contract in a really tough place. So what I've been kind of advocating for the last 6 months is this concept of the economic downturn clause, which basically says if certain metrics are hit in a very rapid period of time, we have an opportunity to renegotiate the contract in such a way that allows the contract to be continued and not be considered a breach, which allows a relationship, capital R, to continue. Because at the end of the day, it is cyclical. We get out of these things, and you don't want to burn those bridges. That type of practical thinking allows for that relationship to continue without getting into a situation of, this guy just ghosted me and he owes me money, so I got to sue him. It's all about making sure that we're working together in this situation.
John?
I could go really banker on you when you talk about indicators and what to look for. Of course, us in the banking industry, on the commercial side and the retail side, we pay a lot of attention to consumer behavior. And consumer behavior that we're seeing right now is utilization of HELOCs, credit card balances increasing. So when interest rates are rising, putting more on your credit card is not ideal. It's probably the worst thing that you could be doing at this point. But that's what we look to from the banker point of view. But as you've heard from all of us, and I've heard from many of you, a lot of you are working through labor issues, labor shortage issues, not so much on supply chain and getting what you need to do what you need do. It's more on the labor side, so it feels a little different here for the smaller business and the mid-sized business than what we're hearing broad-based. But to the comment of, stay local, stay within your circle. One of our clients came in this morning, one of the first ones in this morning. I'm not sure where you are right now, but he made the comment to me, he's like, the greatest, economic indicator that I have is my UPS driver. He came in yesterday and told me that, they cut 80 routes during the holiday season for UPS. And here recently, this past week, they cut 20 more routes locally in Orlando. And I always hate going to these new apartments, because they don't have these drop boxes. I gotta go run all these different apartment complexes. But in the last 2 weeks, I haven't made a single run to a single apartment complex on my run. So to me, that's a great leading indicator as a local community banker. What I listen to is, what are the consumers doing? I drive around town and I see restaurants more or less full. I see parking lots more or less full. I see more or less traffic around town. So you all have those same eyes and ears within your sphere. So what I'm paying attention to is the consumer behavior. And right now, the consumer behavior is showing some signs of stress, which you would expect as inflation is starting to cut into folks' ability to continue to live a lifestyle they ain't grown accustomed to. So from my point of view, that's what I'm seeing. And I would just encourage the group to look around your circle, look around your vendors, your suppliers, your partners, whether it's a UPS driver or someone else. And I asked the question, how about Amazon? Is Amazon cutting into it? And Amazon's actually laying off drivers here locally. So it's not competition coming and taking, it's just a change in consumer behavior. And that's just one example of many that we all can give within our business.
One of the things that we probably should do is not only talk to our vendors, our partners, but talk to our competitors as well. In the CPA business, we had to give across the board raises of anywhere from 20 to 25% to keep the recruiters from stealing all our talent. And every CPA firm in town has had the same issue. And talking to my competitors, everybody's saying they either did one or two things. They either went to the client list and said, hey, you gotta go because we can't afford to hire the people to serve you anymore. Or two, they're gone to their customers or their clients and said, expect an increase of anywhere from 10 to 15% right off the bat, just, not passing through all the costs, but a significant amount. So one of the things that you may find if you're in the same industry is talk to your competitors, see what they're doing, see if they have the same issues, how are they dealing with it. And by that competition and the relationship, as Brian talks about, is you may find some way to have some synergy between you and them, team up, especially if there's an opportunity that you can source, but not fully, and they have the capacity to do so. Maybe you can come together and find an opportunity when things are tough.
Well,
the federal government's our main client, the Department of Defense, does mean that they don't have the same issues on getting money down. One of these attempted to us twice in the last 6 weeks is, where we'll work at risk, knowing that there's an authority to proceed that will be paid later. Twice we've been told, no, we don't know when that money is flowing down to a continuing resolution. So that has an effect. Second thing, talking about respond to environment, the federal government's got much more, we're a best value firm. Technical solution, past performance, project management, cost. That's your make decision. They've gone what's called LPTA, low price technically acceptable. They don't read the proposal. They will go ahead and just read who's the low cost and see if it meets the minimum requirements. And it goes back to a line that my son gave me 7 years ago when he was trying to save up money to buy an iPhone. He said, Dad, can I start doing the yard? I said, we've got somebody. He said, well, Dad, I'll do it for half the price and half as well. Well, that's what we're getting right now. And so, that's when you look at, everybody has their own idiosyncrasies where they compete, but it's getting that way as far as in our environment that we have to, hey, what are we going to pick and choose to work on?
Okay, let's take a couple questions from the group here. Anybody have a burning issue? I'm shy. We've got a lot of wisdom up here.
So, talk to a lot of business people, and say whether we're in a recession or not a recession. Geographically, being here where we are is probably one of the biggest pluses, regardless of whether we're in a recession or not. Also, at the same time, you talk to business people, small business people about Florida is not a particularly friendly state when it comes to litigation. And one of the states we compete with is Texas, which perceptively is much more amenable to small business. So the legislature's getting ready to understand there's a lot of talk and more of a friendly climate for tort reform in Florida. Anybody have a perception of, great geographic state and if we actually got some meaningful tort reform, could that help us even more from a small business standpoint?
I think one of the key things that makes us better than Texas is we can keep the lights and air conditioning on. Tort reform is something that comes through all the time. I'm a little bit biased. I've worked both sides of that. I'm a bit of a utility player. I had a solo practice for 10 years, and the other 10 years I was I worked with what would be considered corporate law firms. I've worked for insurance companies in defense capacity, and I've chased those ambulances with some of the best of them. What I find interesting is, the insurance rate legislation always goes through, and the insurance rates always seem to go up. It's just one of those things. Sometimes I feel like we as consumers are kind of caught in the middle of that. But I do agree with you that tort reform is something that is always going to be seen as a perception thing, right? Regardless of whether rates go up or don't, it's a perception thing. Florida advocates for tort reform. I have a business, I don't want it to tort, so I'm going to come to Florida. What I think is probably stronger for businesses is dispute resolution clauses in their contracts. Get out of the court system, get in front of somebody like the AAA or JAMS, one of those associations that has binding arbitration, and get out of that system where you're actually being, where the controversy or the conflict is being decided is being ruled upon by somebody with some deep experience in the nature of those contracts, and not somebody whose qualification was 18 years old with a driver's license.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
The governor's office is very pro-business, and everybody comes down here to Florida because of that. Should we be concerned about the proposed legislation to take over, for the governor to take over the Reedy Creek Improvement District?
Well, that's a high button, I don't think any. So I'll go ahead and I'll be the sacrificial lamb on this one.
Turn on the recorder.
Please turn the cameras off. You hit a very good point. The political climate in Florida is extremely business friendly. And when politicians on any side of the aisle start playing politics to score points, it usually is not a good long-term play, it's a short-term bump. As it relates to the Reedy Creek issue, is it time for that to transition away from Disney from the intent? I think we all can look around and see that our economy here in Orlando has diversified significantly since. We have a thriving economy that is not solely dependent on the mouse. And did folks in the government see an opportunity to make a play to get rid of something maybe they haven't liked for a long time? That's also very probable in this scenario. And while it was needed to help bring Disney in a pro-business environment, it's suspect on the way that we're trying to move forward without it. Is it time for that to evolve? Probably. Is it a bad thing for our local economy? I don't think. I think it's somewhat of a non-event. I think it has a lot more political ramifications than economic, and it'll be interesting to see how it'll play out.
sounded like a politician. Good job.
I'm gonna go back to the panel.
I got one that kind of ties in. You know, I watched the State of the Union last night, and you saw a huge push against large corporations. And we're here, small business owners, like you said. And the biggest issue was that, what y'all brought up, relationships with the customer. And we all went through about a downturn where we go, and we talked about vendors and some of the customers. Just comment on that, how that could have a negative political effect if we don't stay in touch with our customers.
Sure, I mean, I'll pivot from the political side into the business world. I mean, the great thing about our country and why it's been the most successful form of government is it's of the people, by the people. And why I believe small business always outperforms the large multinational businesses over the long run is because you all are a lot more closely connected to your customer. And so, that's a little bit of a pivot of the people for the people. I think as you get larger, you start having greater ambition and you start losing that touch with those that are most important to you, you open yourself up for new competitors to come into the market with a new great idea to take you out. And that is the biggest risk that everyone here has, is if you decide, oh no, it's recession, I'm going negative, I'm grabbing my hard hat, I'm digging a foxhole, I'm getting low, I'm gonna lay low, let the bullets fly, and then I'll come out and reemerge when this ugly recession is gone, you're gonna lose customers. It's the exact opposite. Don't dig a foxhole, go out there, be bulletproof, walk around, make sure you're staying connected. Be more connected with your customers now than you were when times were good. Be more connected with your vendors now than when times were good. Be more connected with we've all had to be more connected with our teams because of the wage pressure and the lack of folks who are willing to work. That's the one thing we didn't touch on, and Brian didn't touch on. Part of the issue that we have with wage inflation, and all of us are dealing with finding folks to work at various different levels, is the labor participation rate continues to go down. So as we have these stressors, you got to really wrap your arms around the people who matter the most to you. And when the clouds are forming, that's the time to do it. Don't wait until the tornado is ripping through. It's too late at that point. Clouds are forming, wrap your arms around your people.
The same metaphor of don't dig yourself in a foxhole. And with current, like inflation, recession, and obviously a lot of companies, small companies have an issue with cash flow. Current, simple not to tell you don't refinance right now because the interest rates are so high. But do you think any scenarios just make sense right now just to kind of keep fighting for a longer term rather than, all right, let's just see if we can get debt down a little more? Because it's kind of like a catch-22 thing. If you want to fight, you have to invest. And you have to see more than right now. I don't know what your experience, what you see in the
Well,
past.
listen, I can address this. We went through the first recession. I went 3 years not getting paid. Went in debt, borrowed $300,000 credit card, $1 million in debt. Had to go, after our first child was born, my wife was going to stay home. Had to have that discussion. Hey, honey, listen, I got a job I love, it's not paying. I need you to go back to work so we can have some income coming. As you can imagine, that went over quite well. 6 months later, we're starting to get some work and having that same discussion with her. Hey, honey, I'm sorry for borrowing everything against the house, tapping the retirement accounts. But the good news is, babe, it's all in my name. You can apply for credit and we can go ahead and rebuild. And she did. So if you're an entrepreneur, you just got to be smart on knowing that. I've got a guy who's our chief devil's advocate, is a former attorney named Bill Grimm. If some of you guys might know him, former partner of Gray Robinson, he's professor at Rollins Crummer. He had me sit on a panel once with a guy pitching for money. And, you know, when I came out, hey, Greg, go for it. And after a break, and Bill pulled me aside, put the finger in the chest. Hey, tell him what he thought. Tell him what you really believe, because he's going to go and bet it all. And if he's wrong, so we came back together, and I said, hey, I don't think it's going to work. Here's why, and this and that. And he said, thank you. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to do it. I want to make sure it's the right one. So as you make that decision, just know you vetted by some other people who you trust. Might not be friends, but objective talkers. All people in this group here want to succeed, and I know Jeff's done a great job facilitating entrepreneurs and other people here to connect. But if it's the time, you know, the FedEx was started. I mean, you can go back how many firms were started during recessions, and you know the story of Fred Smith, hey, flying out to Vegas and wanting $23,000 to make payroll to keep that firm going. There's a story behind at least one every entrepreneur of things that they took a tremendous risk on that probably might not have paid off if they did take the risk. But hey, you know, you're going to miss, you know, you're going to strike out every time if you don't swing the bat. It's only you're going to hit the room. So that's your call to make. But talk to some people who you trust and go forward, because when we did that, and I think a lot of us got spoiled by how low these interest rates were. Okay, 20 years ago, 6%. Hey, that, you know, 40 years ago, you know, they were 20%. So I think we get spoiled by forgetting on how good we have it now.
I would just say, I remember when I was in college, a professor telling me any rate under 7% is considered free money. So I love just quoting him. But,
Just want to amplify your point really about optimistic. So my firm we work with owners and their teams on enhancing value. And we started an exercise last fall with a lot of our clients where we essentially fabricated headwinds. So we created scenarios that are now here. Right? So we wanted to rethink everything that relates to business. And a lot of what's been said here is profoundly accurate. Right? Just rethinking your ecosystem, your vendors, your supply chain, all that value that you can get around the table with the owner and the team, really create tactical plans. Makes a big difference, right? I mean, airplanes take off into a headwind for a reason. And so your point, Josh, is so valid. Be opportunistic. And we're working with businesses now that have created what they're calling their 2023 disruption plan. So they're not going to let macroeconomic factors inhibit their growth. They're looking at their microeconomic world, what's in that world. So everything you guys have said is right on the line. It's the ecosystem. CPA, your banker, your vendors, and rethinking your customer base, your services, your point, Wayman, in terms of adding services, right? How do you diversify? So believe it or not, there's actually a path to enhancing business value in the midst of tough economic times. And I'm seeing it in this community time after time, and I've yet to find a sector that does not have that ability. So, great point.
I know we're bumping up on the 10 o'clock hour. It seems to me, and Brian and I are from South Carolina, so we don't have the pleasure of knowing but a handful of you that are here in this room. But what I've heard and what I've taken away from the conversation today is just the importance of relationships. It's come up over and over with the panel and in the questions that we have. And relationships are two-way streets. And I think the most important part of that is, can you expect loyalty from your suppliers and your clients and your banker? Are you loyal to them? And that, to me, is as important as anything in navigating what could be rough waters. It's not always smooth sailing. Where you have those relationships is how you navigate.
Thanks. Okay, we're running out of time here, so I want to ask one last question. There are strategies and tactics for increasing cash flow this year, particularly the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the CARES Act. There are some others, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this year. I'm going to go to Jed on this one. And Jen, if you could talk about ERC, the Employee Retention Credit, the R&D Tax Credit, the ICDS for exporters. What are some of the other ideas to improve cash flow, add cash to the balance sheet?
If you're not familiar with the Employee Retention Credit called the ERC, you need to get involved with it. At first, there was a bright line test saying that if your revenue dropped from a baseline in 2019, that you would qualify. But there's other tests that you can qualify for the credit as well, and that's supply chain interruption, and also if you have a government shutdown. It's the supply chain interruption that is where the devil is in the detail. We, as a CPA firm, we're kind of focused on the bright line test, but in the last 6 months, we probably have 40 clients that are combined going to collect about $15 million in ERC credits. And it's because of the fact that we look beyond just that bright line test and went to the supply chain disruption, and they qualify it. And the gentleman who mentioned about the State of the Union and big corporate, in my industry, I deal with you guys that own businesses. It's a one-way street when you go to deal with the government. It's you paying taxes year after year after year. This is the first opportunity as a small business, other than PPP loans, that you get something back. Because we all know that the corporations that are large get a lot of back from the government because of their lobbying power. So don't dismiss this opportunity. Look at it, call your CPA. There's tax specialist groups all throughout the country, and that's all they're doing. So take advantage of the ERC if it's available, because it's there for you all. And you probably didn't lay off anybody, so you're the ones that really help the economy by keep making payroll. The other thing I'll say about cash flow is that, being a small business person, you're probably making quarterly estimated payments every year. And if the business does slip a little bit this year, make sure you get with your CPA and say, do I need to make this big payment in June because my revenues or my income through May are not as high as last year? So don't just go by what we call a safe harbor, because that's the easiest and the simplest way to keep you from being in an under penalty out of an underpayment penalty situation. But look each quarter, do you really need to make that payment? Because once the IRS has it, you're not getting it back until you file your next year's return. And that could be very valuable cash flow to you.
All right, I think we're out of time, so I want to, Brian?
Just say something a little
Yeah,
off.
sure, go ahead.
I'm going to steal this mic here for a second because we're getting ready to leave, and I wanted to just say something off topic because there's no way I'm going to be able to talk to each one of you, but we have been seeing a giant uptick in cybersecurity breaches with companies. I would encourage you guys, when you go back to the office today, to pull your insurance policies and see what is and is not covered by cybersecurity breaches. I would also encourage you to contact your IT vendor and ask them what exactly it is that they're doing to protect you. Because all cybersecurity firms are IT people, but not all IT people are cybersecurity firms. And while there is a way to get around things with the social engineering or the phishing, it's just, we're just seeing a lot of it. And this is my new mantra, is check your cybersecurity. All the protections that we're talking about right now for recession aren't going to do you any good if someone just basically took over your database and deleted it. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
It's okay. If you would join me in thanking the panel. That was fabulous. Some of you, when you registered, you did a little assessment. It's called the Value Driver Assessment. I've got about a dozen of them, and I'm going to welcome you to, if you haven't done one, it takes about 4 minutes. Take a picture of that QR code, and it'll take you right to it. We're also going to send you an email to this, and it comes with a really pretty graphic like this. And essentially, anything that's red or orange are things that you have to deal with. So as a complimentary advice package to you is we would have a group of us, all right, available to walk through why you came up with that particular graph where you had exit path issues or asset protection or whatever it is, growing value, right? This particular one was actually from somebody in this group, right? So there were a lot of different things that were going on. The questions are simple. I encourage you to do it. Lastly, also take a picture of this one. This is the evaluation form. We will also send you one through the email, but these are only as good as the feedback we get. Okay, and I just want to appreciate, I just say that I want to thank you for all this and appreciate your feedback. One thing I would like to do right now, just if my friend Nasser Adea could come up here real quick. He was involved yesterday with a workforce summit at, which involved the presidents of Valencia College, UCF, the workforce partnership. And some of the things that we talked about here today have a lot of bearing on actually some of the things that we're talking about. So just if you take 2 minutes there.
Thank you. Good morning. He says 2 minutes. Earlier he told me you have half an hour.
Yeah.
But I'm kidding. I'm Nasser Hidayat. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Career and Workforce Education at Valencia College. I've been at the college for, I'm going fast, actually. So for 28 years. And just very quick history about the college. It opened the door to our students back in 1967. Under 500 students, $5 per credit. Today, we are 74,000 students strong between credit and non-credit, offering 38 associate science degrees, under 100 college credit certificates, 6 baccalaureate degrees, and currently we have our 7th baccalaureate degree in public safety administration with the Department of Education. Hopefully next year, this time, we will open our door to our students for that baccalaureate degrees. I heard our panel talk about trust and relationship. I'd like to add collaboration and partnership. And yesterday, Workforce Summit was just to demonstrate that we are in it together as a community. Valencia, when it opened its door, it was Valencia Junior College. In 1971, our permanent building opened on Kirkland Road, Valencia West Campus. So we changed our name to Valencia Community College. In 2011, we changed our name again to Valencia College, and because of our academic focus, that's when we started offering baccalaureate degrees. And when you offer the baccalaureate degrees, you should be either state college or no community, but our DNA is still the same. We are the community, and we cannot, and that was the theme of our Workforce Summit yesterday, that we cannot do this alone. We are in it together. We value your input. We value your partnership. And when we develop a program, we want to make sure that our students have the knowledge and skills by the time they graduate and leave the college. When they come to you, they have the skills and the knowledge you need. So what we do is that we do not develop any program without the input of our community partner, business leaders, just like yourself. So I invite you, all of you, if you like to join our advisory council. Every one of our associate science degree, from hospitality to business to engineering to IT to public safety, they all have their own industry advisory council, and your input matters, and we value your input, and I encourage you to join us. So thanks for the opportunity, and let me know and Paul know if you'd like to join us. We are all in it together. Thank you.
I've been a member of the Business Advisory Council for the last five or 6 years now, and it is very rewarding. I will say this, there have been several companies that I've brought into contact with the college where actually special
certificate programs and also courses were developed in conjunction with the company. And essentially, what does that mean? Well, geez, if I could have 1 or 2 semesters where some of my team as a business are going in on campus teaching a pre-selected group of people or pre-volunteer group of people who are in a particular course of study. Now all of a sudden I'm touching these people in the classroom and bringing them right into the company as interns. So this is the type of thing that's going on. I just want to encourage you all to take advantage of that opportunity. Contact information is this will be sent around to all of you along with the slides from Brian earlier. Really do take advantage of the contact with the college. It's really fantastic. On behalf of all of our friends at CEO Leadership Forums, South State Bank, I want to thank you all for being here with us this morning, and drive safe. Thanks.